going to talk about an approach that I actually developed in my tenure as an associate professor in the University of Maryland. I'll try to convince you guys all that this approach is the approach we should take in the context of cybersecurity. And maybe I should start with a caveat. I'm going to talk about a few things that I wasn't really supposed to talk about. But yesterday I had this really nice conversation with Alexis, who will speak tomorrow. Because usually you don't really know who sits in the audience, you want to make sure that everybody is on the same page with respect to whatever that you want to discuss. So the first few slides are slides that we're really supposed to talk about, and that is, and those slides will discuss sort of and will provide some background for the approach. I don't know if you guys know that, but during the 70s and the 90s, the United States experienced rise in crime. Violent crime in the United States was increasing, and police departments across the country didn't really know what to do with it. They tried many approaches, many ways to deal with the soaring crime rates, and nothing really works. Nothing really worked. Folks tried to deploy more police officers across the city. It didn't really reduce the rates of violent crime in the US cities. Police department across the country also tried to shorten the response time to calls for police, and that didn't do the trick either. So, back then, and after trying many approaches, the assumption among criminologists was that, maybe the police department is not really the appropriate agency, to deal with those increasing crime rates. Maybe some kind of a policy needs to be developed. Police departments across the nation didn't really like that, and so they were starting to look for innovations. Things to do differently in the context of offline crime. And they started teaming up with criminologists more closely. One of the interesting and simply look for new ways to deal with crime. One of the interesting finding that was discussed and that was essentially found during the late 80s was this really interesting finding which suggested that if you look at the city, any city in the United States, in Canada, in Israel, across the globe, and you will try to analyze where police calls or calls for police help comes from and where crime is concentrated, you will find that in most places around the globe, only 5% of the street segments produce more than 50% of crime. Right, and that is a really important finding that folks replicated over and over again in the United States and across the globe. And this finding is known as the hotspot of crime. Hotspots of crime are essentially places where crime is relatively high in comparison to other areas across the city. And so the suggestion was, after discovering this important finding in 1989, Sherman and Weisbord reported that, focusing in the city of Minnesota. They suggested to take those hotspots of crime and simply deploy more police force in those places. And so what they did was they took the street segments in the city of Minnesota and they divided it to control group and a treatment group. The control group was essentially those neighborhoods and street segments that did not receive any specific attention. And then the treatment received 2 and sometimes even 3 times more policing, in the community, and the results were meaningful and indicated that in the areas, crime was decreasing across the community, but in the control group, where more policing was deployed, you guys can see that across in 9 months of the experiments, crime dropped more sharply in those communities, right? That finding was replicated more and more, and because of that, police department across the United States, and I think around the globe more and more, has adopted the policing model that is called hotspot policing, right? We identify those areas in the community that generate a lot of crime, we focus efforts there, and that will reduce crime in the community. And we believe that this is one of the, this practice, this intervention, was one of the reasons to the sharp decrease in crime rates, violent crime rates, that we see in the United States starting there. Now, I've been, this goes on record, so maybe I should have a caveat there. This is only one of the intervention, right? I mean, Bill Sable, my friend and colleague who used to run the Bureau of Justice Statistics, keeps, pushing back on that. And there's a paper that essentially suggests that the hotspot policing is responsible, and the implementation of hotspot policing across the United States is responsible to between 8 to 10% of this decrease that you see here. It's not a whole lot, but it's still one way to decrease crime that we know that essentially is effective. Why is this important, and what does it essentially tells us? Well, it tells us that Guardian's openness to innovation combined with close collaboration with social scientists could prove useful in combating street crime. Now, let's fast forward 30 years, and it looks like nowadays we experience a similar situation to the one we experienced 30 years ago or 40 years ago in the United States in the context of street crime, but this time only in online environment. This is a recent figure that the IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center in the United States, produce, and that essentially portray the increasing number of complaints as well as the increasing number of costs of different types of cybercrime reported in the United States. As we see, of course, we don't have an official portal that I'll be able to report findings from with respect to the number of actual online crimes that exist, but we know that the cost as well as the number of complaints that are received by the FBI is increasing, and that's part of the reason why there's some fear, right, among Americans. And in fact, in the recent Pew research, scholars asked respondents what is the number one crime that they're worried about, and the majority of respondents indicated that it's cybercrime. Right? And that was way, above terrorist activity as well as street crime. And so to this environment, to this climate of fear and increase in crime rate or crime or cybercrime costs, many startup companies, many sort of organizations, step in and try to help us all. And Benoit, I hope that will not impact your donation rate, what I'm going to say now, but at the end of the day, we don't really know what these guys bring to the picture. Apologies if you belong to one of these groups right here, right? But we have, many security companies that offers, amazing products for a lot of money, but I'm not really sure whether it really works, right? In addition to those companies who are trying to sell us product and reduce crime in our organizations as well as on our own computers, we know that governments across the world enact laws that allows us to prosecute cyber criminals, as well as regulations that require large organizations to embed in order to reduce the probability of crime on their infrastructure. Now again, does it really work? I don't know, right? I really don't know, and I don't think nobody knows. And the reason why we don't know is that we simply don't have all those evaluations, scientific evaluations, that will tell you what works and what doesn't in the context of reducing, preventing, and mitigating cybercrime in our society. And so the possible solution, of course, is more information. We need to produce more and more information about the effectiveness of products, antivirus, IDS, IPS, all those amazing tools that cost a lot of money, but at the end of the day, I'm not really sure what they bring into the picture. But also policies, all those awareness and training programs, right, that we have implemented in many of the organizations, right? We need to really evaluate whether they work or not. And the pitch and the approach I would like to sort of introduce you to calls for an evidence-based cybersecurity. So if we want to evaluate the effectiveness of tools and policies, I propose that we should adopt the evidence-based cybersecurity principles. Briefly, and again, this is not something I invented. I mean, it has been a while. People have been talking about evidence-based policing, evidence-based, health, and now I think that we should even start talking about evidence-based cybersecurity, which should essentially suggest that we need to move away from a practice where people make decisions, CISOs, police officers, government make decisions based on political, financial, and social background, and into a model where those decisions with respect to tools, with respect to policies that we need to implement in the context of cybersecurity are based or are taken based on evidence, hardcore scientific evidence that really allows you to assess what works and what doesn't. What I propose is also to collect this evidence with a focus on the human. And again, Alexis and I had this disagreement last night with respect to whether we should spend efforts on the human or on technology. In my mind, spending effort and technology only answer half the question. The human and the key actors, right, the key players in the cybercrime ecosystem, those are the important entities we should spend a lot of time collecting evidence around and test the effectiveness of tools and policies. When we collect data, I propose we should engage in rigorous scientific research design. Experiments, field experiments, right, which are the golden standard of scientific research. If disciplines around, many scientific disciplines believe that experiments are the golden standards, why shouldn't we as cybersecurity professionals adopt this practice? We should, of course, also use surveys, right? Surveys like the survey Michelle indicated and discussed earlier today, but also surveys from antivirus logs and IDS logs, right? Simply try to figure out how things look like in an organization before and after. And of course, observations, right, are very important in order to produce rigorous scientific research with respect to the effectiveness of a suggested policy or a suggested tool. The key principle, the key issues that I think that this approach should be useful for are identifying online threats and vulnerabilities, as well as educate targets of crime. I think that this approach should be very relevant for guiding policy development and Guardian's efforts to secure cyberspace. And I also think that this approach should guide the design and configuration of computing environments that can mitigate effectively the consequences of cybercrime events. Everybody talks about prevention. Nobody's talking about mitigation. We know that you patch systems, and you make it more costly or more difficult for the bad guys to get in, but they will find a way to get in. We're still in a point where it takes us a lot of time to detect these guys' presence on the system. I think that the approach I just discussed will be relevant in allowing us with developing tools that could mitigate the consequence of cybercrime. And let me, since I know we have a very diverse audience sitting in this room, let me just try and demonstrate how this approach should be relevant in the context of law enforcement efforts, policymakers' efforts, as well as security expert efforts. So, as you guys know, I assume many of you know, I think I've seen in the program that we have police officers and some military folks sitting here in the room. The most commonly used approach by law enforcement agencies across the world is to try and take down online darknets, right, that support and enable the development and progression of online crime, right? And you guys can read on this in, I'm sure the Canadian government released their efforts in this context. DOJ, Department of Justice, constantly have press releases on successful takedowns. But what I think folks are missing is the fact that once you take down a market, what the bad guys are doing is they simply move to another market. So in a way, if you're the FBI and you took down Wall Street, you actually did a huge favor to Nightmare because now they get all their business, right? And law enforcement agencies are heavily involved in this. And what we find in our research is that this model of client-server that is commonly used by the Darknet markets begins to, I would say, begins to be less and less popular among the bad guys because of those law enforcement efforts, right? And hopefully you have a better understand the client-server model where you go to a server, you ask for information, and the information comes back to you. When you go on Nightmare or all of those Darknet markets that are hosted on the Darknet, essentially it follows the same model. And so when the feds take a server, nobody can get information from the server. The criminals are clever. And so what they do now is, instead of using the peer-to-peer communication model, they develop, instead of using the client-server model, they draw heavily on peer-to-peer communication models instead. And this is important and relevant in the context of law enforcement because under the peer-to-peer communication model, you can't take down the market. You can't take down the server. And the feds are not there. They're still doing law enforcement the way they're familiar with. Not only that, we know that the bad guys no longer use Darknet markets using the client-server model, but instead they use Telegram to advertise their products. They use WhatsApp to advertise their products, right? So it makes sense for us to spend some time thinking about, what do we do and be maybe a step ahead of the curve when we try to, inject some intervention that will reduce the probability of folks buying and selling stuff over the internet. This is one example of a peer-to-peer communication website that is commonly used by criminals. It's called Open Bazaar. And you can buy pretty much everything you can imagine, right, in Open Bazaar. And so if we take the evidence-based cybersecurity approach to this problem, what we think we should do is we should gather as much intelligence as possible from those markets, the traditional markets as we know them, the peer-to-peer communication, markets, and also Telegram, in order to really try and come up with interventions we can inject between the criminals and the sellers and dissuade them from buying and selling, from disseminating malware, right? And that is essentially what we do. In Georgia State University, we have a fairly large group of people who monitor those markets, and this is not unique. I mean, maybe the size of the group and the size of what we do is unique because we sit on more than 60 markets and we scrape those markets on a weekly basis. We try to figure out, what's hot in terms of commodity. We track vendors, we track customers with the goal of injecting intervention. And I really like this figure. This is fresh off the oven, and I was tweeting about this yesterday. What you see here is essentially, our attempt to understand the most commonly used words on the digital products section on, in this case, 20 online markets that we monitor. And as you guys can see, porn is very popular. Databases is awesome. The USA is important, and that speaks volume to the targets, right, of those individuals. Of course, you see the UK, and then Canada is over here as well. Right, but so those countries, right, are definitely, they're interesting, and they are the subject of cyber criminals' discussions and products that they sell over the darknet. And some of the, I assume that many of you have seen in the past, so I didn't propose to go on the darknet and show you exactly how things looks like live. But these are some of the advertisements you see with respect to online fraud. You can buy citizenships. In fact, you can buy citizenships for Canada as well. I just forgot to upload that screenshot. Green cards, of course. You can buy cash, like 20,000 fake dollars for $800. So if anyone is interested, I can hook you up with someone. And And you can buy pharmacy prescription drugs. You can buy, of course, bank cards and social security numbers. You can buy a lot of software that will support your criminal activity. You can buy DDoS attacks. You can buy hacks. And I think that, once we understand what's on there, what we as policy or, as scientists or cybersecurity experts should do is we should try and come up with innovative approaches, right, to dissolve those markets and the social networks that exist on those markets. And again, this is just an example of what we do from 3 markets, right? I mean, you see that the number of advertisement fluctuates, right, on a weekly basis. And not only the number of advertisement, the number of vendors, right, the people who offer products fluctuates as well on a weekly basis. So that's important information because, if you're interested in injecting a meaningful intervention without taking down a website, that will support a potential, idea. What we do also is we track the revenue these guys make. And Benoit wrote about that in the context of ransomware. I'm not sure whether he wrote about it in the context of other crimes. But we know that you can, see how much money the vendors are actually making because of the ratings of the customers. You can track the revenue. Right? So if you can do that, you can inject an intervention in order to influence and impact and generate some issues for the vendors, right? And test whether it works or not. You can also build a social network of these guys and identify the big fish, right? Because we do this across time, you can also track and figure out when someone will become a big fish and then inject an intervention. I mean, there's so many things we can do if we just collect the data in a rigorous scientific way and run analysis, right, in a rigorous scientific way. You can also find unique patterns, right, if you do that in a rigorous way. And one of the interesting patterns that, I'm under an NDA, so I can't really disclose too much about, but, look forward for the second report that we have from this research because it'll be shocking. We found that there is a market for TLS certificates on the darknet. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are tech savvy and know what TLS certificates are. The TLS certificate essentially, to simplify things, allow your website to have the green bar. And essentially what it means is that the traffic that comes from your server to a computer, your client computer, is encrypted. In order to obtain this, you need to encrypt the traffic that comes in from the server and to the client computer. And there are 3 levels of encryption: DV, OV, and EV. The organizations that are responsible for this encryption and providing you those TLS certificates are called certificate authorities. And when you apply for those certificates, you pay a lot of money to obtain those certificates, especially the EV certificate, which essentially indicate that the organization, the certificate authority, validated that you are who you say you are, to the point where they saw your bank account, the server was up for 6 months, and so on and so forth. What's the consequences of you not having an EV, OV, or DV certificate on the website? Well, if someone goes to your website and you don't have this encryption, there's a probability that they will get this warning, and so it will dissuade people from the website. So the bad guys know that, and they launch phishing attacks, and they want to make sure that they increase the level of trust among among their target. And so what we find is that you have people out there who sell TLS certificates, right? The EV certificate, the most prestigious certification ever. I should probably stop here, but again, look forward for a report we're going to put together that details more about the quality of those certificates as well. And how they are obtained. So again, the fact that we sit on the darknet and we scrape on a weekly basis, that allows us to identify those unique trends. We believe that the evidence-based cybersecurity approach also makes sense in the context of guiding policy. Again, we talked a lot about the feds trying to deter. But at the end of the day, the approach that the feds are taking is very defensive. It's not reactive. And so, maybe it makes sense for us to be more reactive in our attempt to secure cyberspace in a more efficient way. And people talk about hackback, and maybe that will be an approach to be more proactive. But I have a different suggestion. What if we identify hackers and the bad guys fairly early in their career, and then try to nudge them away from being a bad player to being a good player? Okay, and that's what we try to do. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a website called Zone Age and the hacking culture, but hackers usually begin their career by defacing a website. What does it mean to deface a website? You go on a website, you take over, and you change the content like someone would have taken over my presentation right now and replaced the content with this message. Okay? Because hackers they have to build reputations among their peers. That will allow them access to more prestigious groups. That will allow them an opportunity to buy more sophisticated tools and so on and so forth. They need to make sure everybody is aware, right, on those activities. And Zone Age is one of the websites that allows them to advertise their activities. So each and every one of it is a ClearNet Surface Web website that each and every one of you can go to. This is the interface. It's zoneage.org. And if you go on archive, and archive, special archive, you'll be able to see a list of hacks that the script kiddies, the non-sophisticated hackers, generated an hour ago. Okay, the website is being updated on a moment every hour or so, and this is how the data looks like. You're going to get a date. You're going to get the alias, the hacker alias, which is really important. You get a domain name, the operating system on the server, as well as a picture of the way the website looked like after the defacement. So hopefully you guys can see this one here. Why is this website so important, and how it could be relevant in the context of policymakers? Well, you have these aliases right here. And those aliases could be linked with these actors' Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram names, right? And so that's what we find. So Santi Boy right here, this is his Facebook page. There are people with pages on Twitter. We find these guys, of course, on the Darknet, right? This is a website that we sit in, the Darknet, and we monitor quite heavily. It's called Crime Network. And we find evidence to these guys' presence there as well. So Pond, where is it? Where's the guy? Well, I promise you he's there. I can't really find him here. We also find them on Telegram groups that we sit in. Okay, so again, Arrow Squad, is right here. Why is that important? Well, at the end of the day, we're talking about humans. And I believe you can influence humans. You can nudge them to comply with requests. And so what we do is we ask them to stop. Simple as that. Now, we're not being as obvious, right? Essentially what we do is we friend them. And this is a study, pilot study that we ran, and since then we were able to replicate it, and the finding that I will report here I can't really discuss further, but we were able to replicate this finding. We put together this persona of a hacker, and we looked for hackers that generated hacking activity on Zone Age. We friended them. And then we had a group of 35 hackers which we randomly assigned to group, a control group, and a treatment. The treatment group received the following message from us, suggesting that essentially the FBI just raided our house, right, with guns and everything. And all we asked the guy, the script kiddie, is to lay low for a week. Okay? Let me show you the really interesting findings, right? I mean, many people, when we started that, indicated, it won't work. Look at the control group and treatment averages before the message we sent, and look at the averages after. 50% drop, right, in the volume of attacks that these guys generated was just a simple, stupid message that we sent to them. And we were able to replicate it with more people on other platforms, right? So maybe it makes sense for us not necessarily to just chase people, right, and incarcerate them. Maybe it makes sense for us to nudge them away to our side. The other thing that I will discuss, and I know I'm running over my time, maybe 2 more minutes, if that's okay? 3 minutes, okay, that's good. is the relevance of this approach in the context of the security industry efforts in cyberspace. As I indicated earlier, I'm all about mitigation, right? I mean, people talk about prevention, but I'm all about mitigation. And for folks who are doing cybersecurity and sitting in this room, they're familiar, I assume, with the asymmetry of cyberspace. The fact that across the cyber kill chain, which I'm not going to elaborate on because of time, the offender is always a step ahead of us. And I know computer scientists don't really like the cyber kill chain, so apologies. But this is just one framework, right, that we can use. And so the asymmetry between the defender and offender exists throughout the cyber kill chain, with the offender being a step ahead all the time, right, in terms of investing resources, in terms of knowledge, in terms of money, and so on. We believe that the evidence-based cybersecurity approach can shift the asymmetry between defender and offenders in one key point across the cyber kill chain, and that is exploitation. We believe that we can nudge people, nudge hackers, to expose their presence on the system by adopting sociological, psychological models and configure the systems accordingly. And let me just give you a brief example of how we think we can and how we are trying to do that. Again, we're scientists, so, and I like running field experiments. What we do is we deploy honeypots, high interaction honeypots that emulate servers. The vector of attack, right, the way the bad guys break into our system is through brute force attacks. They usually don't know, they don't know that they participate in experiments, but what they're in a system will randomly assign them to different conditions, right? We find that you can definitely nudge these guys to behave in a predictable way. In one of the studies, and again, I don't have too much time, so I'm not going to walk you through all the slides here, we find that the first thing that hackers do on the system is gather reconnaissance, right? And this finding was verified by Damon McCoy and his group, several times with personal computers. The first thing that folks are doing on the system is they gather reconnaissance, right? So this is keystrokes from our honeypots that we deployed both in Israel and China, and you guys can see it again. I don't have too much time to elaborate on this. You see that in the first session they generate in our system, in Israel, 92% of the computers, as well as 61%, had intelligence collection commands embedded in comparison to 44 and 31% in Israel and China action commands, and 28 and 17.7% password change commands that were entered on the system. So, and this is another interesting finding. We see that without gathering intelligence on the system, these guys don't really do anything, right? They need to gather intelligence, and that will determine how they will progress with the event. And so what we do is we're trying to nudge them to behave, right? To expose their presence and knock on doors, touch folders, and so on and so forth. In one of our experiments, the more criminological experiment, we essentially alert the hacker that we detected their presence on the system. I have this video. It's really short. I'm not going to show it to you, but essentially what we do here is once a hacker is on the system, we tell them, who are you? Why are you here? And you'll be amazed by the response we get from these guys. In this specific experiments, we also try to figure out whether that will influence this will influence the rate of reconnaissance command that they produced. And what we find, and this is probably my last slide, we find that once you alert these guys to the fact that you detected their presence on the system, they're less likely to issue reconnaissance commands on the system. Okay? So maybe I should just stop here. I had another finding that Benoit really wanted me to discuss. I can talk to you about this later if you want. I can end with this conclusion suggesting that the evidence-based cybersecurity approach should lead the way in generating empirical evidence around policies and tools, and essentially what our group tried to do, and I think that groups across the world and across the United States should continue doing that. Make this evidence available to practitioners and folks who are doing cybersecurity research. If you are interested in learning more about who we are, and you have to do those plugging, so I apologize. I hate doing this, but it's part of the gig. Please let us know. The evidence-based cybersecurity research group in Georgia State University. We have a cool program that we run with the Israelis in the Hebrew U, where we teach about our approach across 5 days. If you're interested in that, just let us know. Thank you so much for having me.